visionaries in their own fields who will take us on an inspiring journey of ideas, culture, and wisdom. On one side, we have Dr. Aaron Bryant, a distinguished museum curator, historian, and cultural ambassador who has dedicated his life to preserving and sharing the rich history of African American culture. And we have the multi-talented Dr. Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, an acclaimed poet, author, and translator whose work breathes life into the timeless literature. Audience, please put your hand together and give a big round of applause to them. We welcome Mr. Eric Atkins, the Public Diplomacy Officer, U.S. Consulate General, Chennai, Dr. P. Shankar, IAS, Directorate of Public Libraries, Dr. T. Shankara Saravanan, Joint Director, Tamil Nadu Textbook Corporation, Mr. S. Ilango Chandrakumar, Joint Director, Directorate of Public Libraries, Dr. S. Kamakshi, Chief Librarian and Information Officer of Anna Centenary Library, and all the wonderful audience. May I call upon Dr. P. Shankar, IAS, Directorate of Public Libraries, to felicitate our wonderful speakers with a memento. We invite both the speakers onto the stage. We welcome Dr. T. Shankara Saravanan and Mr. S. Ilango Chandrakumar, sir. So it is felicitation time. Okay, it's time to honor Mr. Eric Atkins. Audience, please just give a big round of applause. Now, I request Mr. Eric Atkins to introduce Dr. Aaron Bryant to the audience.
Good morning. I want to especially thank all of you for coming today, taking time out for whatever your normal routine was, your normal schedule, and coming here today to join us. My team and I are privileged to have been spending a lot of time recently at Anna Centenary Library. We recently concluded an exhibition that started on January 20th, the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., and it completed on January 30th, Martyrs' Day, the death anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. Every year, the United States marks the month of February as National Black History Month. We chose February, historically, because it honors the birthday of both our former President, Abraham Lincoln, and Frederick Douglass, a very gifted orator, author, and abolitionist. I encourage you, if you don't know their stories, later today, please take time, after being inspired by the speakers, to go look into the stories of those two great individuals. Black History Month celebrates the contributions of the African American community that have shaped the United States history and the legacy of leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. One cannot truly talk about the American Civil Rights Movement, however, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. without including Mahatma Gandhi. These two great figures never had the opportunity to meet, but Gandhiji's teachings and philosophy, particularly the doctrines of nonviolent resistance, service to the community, and social justice, were a huge influence on King, and through him, the Civil Rights Movement in America. The exhibition we put on was called City of Hope, Gandhi, King, and the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. It showcased Gandhi's influence on civil rights in the United States and his influence on Martin Luther King Jr.'s daring vision for economic justice and human rights worldwide. Dr. Aaron Bryant, who is here with us today, curated that exhibition for the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Bryant is a museum curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. His research has received honors from such institutions as the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library, the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, the United States Justice Department, the United States Congress, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Royal Anthropological Institute in the UK. He has lectured at institutions such as Duke, Johns Hopkins, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, the British Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He also traveled with the U.S. State Department to other countries such as Spain. Dr. Bryant earned his doctorate from the University of Maryland, where he received the Bode Wise Award for his research on the Poor People's Campaign. He also earned his master's degree from Yale and a bachelor's from Duke. Ladies and gentlemen, please let us welcome Dr. Bryant with a big round of applause.
Good morning. So my research on Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi begins with a photograph that was taken in 1966 by a photographer named Bob Fitch. And Bob Fitch was a civil rights photographer during the 1960s, and he traveled with King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and this was during the 1960s as well. And so it was in 1966 that Bob Fitch took this photograph that I ran across, and I had the good fortune of actually having an opportunity to meet with and speak with Bob Fitch about the photograph because I found it really interesting. The photograph featured King, of course, but in the background was an image of Mahatma Gandhi. And I thought that was fascinating considering, you know, as a scholar of visual anthropology and visual culture, I understood that people, particularly African Americans of Martin Luther King Jr.'s generation, they generally would have an image of Jesus Christ in the background, especially since King was a Christian minister. So I thought it was odd that he would have chosen to feature an image of Mahatma Gandhi. And I spoke with Bob Fitch about this image, and it uncovered an entirely new chapter for some research that I was doing that most people don't know anything about. I think that folks don't really understand that, particularly during the 1940s and into the 50s, there were many African American civil rights leaders in the US who were traveling to India and actually studying the teachings and philosophies of Gandhi and the whole idea of peaceful resistance. And they would take this, what they learned in India, about India's independence movement, what they learned about Gandhi and his philosophies, they would take it back to the US and it would help inform their strategies for the civil rights movement. And so today what I would like to talk to you about or present is essentially an opening for a book chapter that I had written about Gandhi, King, and my conversation with Bob Fitch. So Bob Fitch was born in Los Angeles, California. He was a self-taught photographer who was known primarily for his social justice images of the 1960s and early 1970s. Fitch captured iconic photographs of Dorothy Day and Catholic workers' movements, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, as well as Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union. So his work really did focus on social justice, looking at issues related to labor, religious liberty, and economic justice. He is quoted as once saying, "Photojournalism seduced me. It was my way to support the organizing and social justice that was transforming history, our lives, and future." Fitch's father was an ordained minister with the United Church of Christ, a professor of Christian ethics, and dean at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The school historically focused on a social gospel theology of social justice and change. After earning his undergraduate degree in psychology, Fitch later earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in divinity from Pacific, and like his father, he became an ordained minister for the United Church of Christ in 1965. Influenced by the writings of people like James Baldwin and folk musician Pete Seeger, Bob Fitch began photographing while working for the uh, Glide Memorial United Methodist Church in San Francisco, where he worked with gangs, the homeless, and LGBTQ communities. He was also a labor organizer and a draft resistance counselor, and later worked for the California Department of Housing and the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz. He later volunteered with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where he eventually became the organization's photographer. As Martin Luther King Jr.'s official photographer, Bob Fitch captured the movement from behind the scenes, including its meetings and intimate moments inside the King family home. Additionally, Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife, asked Bob Fitch to photograph Dr. King's funeral. Fitch's work would inspire generations, from the National King Memorial in Washington, D.C. to postal stamps. Artists often turned to his work to capture those important moments in the civil rights movement. Bob Fitch captured personal photographs and the private moments, as well as both a participant and an observer of civil rights. In 1966, Fitch captured an iconic and perhaps controversial image of Martin Luther King Jr. In this photo, King stands in an office behind a metal desk. He wears the conventional dark trousers and blazer of a Baptist minister with a white shirt and dark tie tucked neatly behind a sweater or vest. Dr. King stares away from the camera in a direction that is distant from the viewer's left shoulder. The civil rights leader holds a pen in his right hand and folds his arm loosely across his chest. His stance suggests listening, contemplation, or preparation for a response of some kind, as he hovers above a pad and papers that sit on top of a desk. The desk is manageably cluttered. A rotary phone, a Rolodex, a journal or digest, documents, folders, they all hold an assortment of material culture that says something important about this moment and about King. The phone that's on the desk is the multi-line kind that commonly occupied busy offices in the 1960s. It sits in front of the Rolodex that offers easy access to an important network of resources. There are several books on the desk as well. They are visible with 3 titles overtly positioned to be more discernible to viewers. The first title, 5 Smooth Stones, refers to the biblical story of David and Goliath. The book's narrative is an interracial love story set against the backdrop of the civil rights era. The second book has Sloan printed on its spine. It is uncertain to which author or title the spine's print refers to, but perhaps this is a publication by Irving J. Sloan, who authored the book, The American Negro, a chronology and fact book in 1965. The third book is Stranger at the Gates. This is a memoir that focused on the mostly young northern white college students of the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. Activist Fannie Lou Hamer wrote the book's foreword with the assertion that 90% of the Negro people in Mississippi have gone to church all their lives. They have lived with the hope that if they kept standing up in a Christian manner, things would change. Hamer goes on to say, after we found out that Christian love alone wouldn't cure the sickness in Mississippi, she continued, then we knew we had other things to do. So each publication that's on the desk in this photograph gives insight into King's thinking at the time the photo was taken. As he contemplated civil rights beyond the borders of race, age, and geography, emblematic of King's position as a philosopher and a nation's moral conscience, the photograph suggests the minister has been caught in a moment of reflection while contemplating ideas for an essay, speech, or sermon. Now, in the photograph, the office walls are bare. They are stark except for an image of Gandhi that hangs in the direction of King's right shoulder. Only the subtle play and gradation of light and shadow disrupt the solemnity shaped by the background's plane. This is intentional. The position of Gandhi's portrait within the photograph's composition manipulates the viewer's eyes. As one's focus shifts between the photographer's primary subjects, Gandhi and King, from King to Gandhi, then back again, the eye moves through a visual strategy that centers the two men against the wall's white space. This was the image's controversy, for some conservatives at least. Fitch and King presented King as a Christian minister, but they push the envelope and go against the grain of conservative thought and tradition. Rather than following tradition and photographing Dr. King with an image of Jesus Christ, as would be expected of a Christian minister, they chose to photograph Dr. King with an image of Gandhi. For many conservatives, this might have been controversial or a provocative choice, if not blasphemous, to certain sectors of America's religious community. Dr. King argued, however, that Gandhi was one of the few people in modern times to practice the principles of love and peace as lived by Christ. Gandhi transformed the ethics of love, according to King, into a power for morally based social progress and change. Many of King's mentors and predecessors influenced his social and religious philosophies, including a man named Mordecai Johnson, another Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays, and Reinhold Niebuhr. Johnson was a Baptist minister and the first black president of Howard University. King heard Johnson deliver a lecture on Gandhi in Philadelphia in 1950, and the experience impacted King's ideas regarding peaceful resistance for the rest of his life. Howard Thurman was a theologian, civil rights activist, dean of chapel at Howard University, and then later Boston University. Thurman founded the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco in 1944, and the church is considered the first integrated multi-ethnic church in modern U.S. history. Benjamin Mays was a minister, social activist, and president of Morehouse College in Atlanta. This is where King went to undergrad. Mays mentored King during his years as a Morehouse student. And later, Reinhold Niebuhr would influence King's ideas as a doctoral student at Boston University. He was a theologian whose work had a significant impact on theories in early modern international relations. Niebuhr believed that man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. In his first book, A Stride Towards Freedom, which King wrote as an account of the Montgomery bus boycott, the civil rights leader also credited the work of other thinkers who influenced his philosophies, including Gandhi. Gandhi's work provided a nonviolent protest leadership model that King would use throughout his career. Now, getting back to Mordecai Johnson, the first African-American president of Howard University, King attended a lecture that Johnson gave in Philadelphia in 1950, and Johnson had just come back from the World Pacifist Conference here in India that year. Following his return to the U.S., he lectured on Gandhi in South Asia at the Fellowship House of Philadelphia. As a student at Crozier Theological Seminary at the time, King listened as Johnson spoke about the global significance of nonviolent resistance and Indian independence. Johnson's words had a profound impact on King, as the civil rights leader later recalled, and this is what King writes later in his essays. Dr. Johnson had just returned from a trip to India, and to my great interest, he spoke of the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. His message was so profound and electrifying that I left the meeting and bought a half dozen books on Gandhi's life and works. So this would be several years before King actually becomes a minister and leads the Montgomery bus boycott. He's still a student at this point in a master's program in Philadelphia. He would later continue, like most people, I had heard of Gandhi, but I had never studied him seriously. As I read, I became deeply fascinated by his campaigns of nonviolent resistance. I was particularly moved by the Salt March to the Sea and his numerous fasts. The whole concept of satyagraha was profoundly significant to me. As I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time its potency in the area of social reform. King followed these observations with insights that help explain why a Christian minister would pose for this photograph taken by Bob Fitch that privileged a portrait of Gandhi rather than an image of Jesus. And this is actually King's words. Gandhi was probably the first person in history, he wrote, to lift the love ethics of Jesus above mere interaction individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. Love for Gandhi was a potent instrument for social and collective transformation. It was the Gandhian emphasis on love and nonviolence, King continued, that I discovered the method for social reform that I had been seeking for so many months. So most people don't realize that Gandhi had this kind of impact on Martin Luther King Jr. And in a number of his sermons, a number of his book chapters and essays, even articles that he had written for magazines and journals, he talks about the impact that Gandhi and India's independence movement had on his own philosophies, both as a civil rights leader and as a Christian minister. Now, while the Montgomery bus boycott put Martin Luther King Jr. on a global stage, and although he was recognized and celebrated in different parts of the world, we have to remember that the Montgomery bus boycott was actually just a local crusade, specific to Montgomery, Alabama, and not something that was national like India's independence. So it wasn't a global movement. But Dr. King was a grassroots organizer, and it would be several years before he would lead this kind of campaign on the scale of India's independence movement. Protest models offered by Indian activists, therefore, left an impression on the civil rights leader that extended beyond his visit in India in 1959. King viewed global communities as part of a universal culture that required ideological shifts if humanity were to survive. In his essay, The Vision of a World Made New, which he wrote in 1954, one of King's first speeches as a minister, in fact, he addressed the need to replace a fading old global culture with an emerging new world order. And he writes, on a world scale, we have seen the old order in the form of colonialism and imperialism. These lead to domination and exploitation. He would later go on to talk about how he saw India under British rule as an example to compare colonialism in other parts of the world to segregation and discrimination in the US. This particular essay, which he also delivered as a speech, reveals how King's awareness of global inequalities as he drew connections between race, class, and systems of oppression worldwide. It also demonstrates how, early on, oppression around the world was part of King's consciousness even before his first protest, the Montgomery bus boycott. He had become fully convinced, Lewis Baldwin observed, and Lewis Baldwin is a historian who focuses on social movements and has written about King. He had become fully convinced that the struggles of people in Africa and Asia against Western imperialism and colonialism could not be separated from his own people's plight under Jim Crow in the southern United States. So the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi resonate across time, and I would argue continue to offer profound lessons for our lives today. Yep, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Your recollection, memories, and reflection on Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. was inspiring. Now, may I call upon Dr. T. Shankara Saravanan to introduce Dr. Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma to our audience.
Good morning to all. Now we have our next speaker, Mr. Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma. He is an author, translator, and teacher and performer. His translation of the classical Tamil masterpiece, Thirukural, into 3 books, that is Ethics, Power, and Love. Generally, we translate second part of the Thirukural as wealth, but he has used a different terminology called power. It is more suitable than wealth. If you read the chapters of Thirukural, it speaks more about the kings and ministers. 35 chapters were devoted to the kings and ministers, particularly leadership qualities. So he used the term power rather than wealth. The other books of Thomas includes The Safety of Edges. He is a poet himself. He has a collection of poems called The Safety of Edges. And he translated AVVAIYAR also. As the previous speaker mentioned about Mahatma Gandhi, 2 poets very close to the heart of Mahatma Gandhi were THIRUVALLUVAR and AVVAIYAR. Gandhi affectionately used to call Mother Avvai. So he translated AVVAIYAR also. As he translated Thirukural as Ethics, Power, Love, he translated AVVAIYAR as Poems of AVVAIYAR, Give, Eat, and Live. And he has written another book called Body and Earth. He's not only a translator, he's a author, poet, as well as a performer. He used to perform Tirukural with the music. Many of his interviews has been published in Times of India, and he has participated in Chennai International Conference recently. On behalf of Honorable Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, he performed Tirukural with music in Tamil and English. We are going to enjoy his performance. And he is a scholar, not only scholar in Tirukural, he knows how to teach Tirukural to children. He is a very close friend of mine. I'm interacting with for 2-3 years. His Tirukural has been co-published by Tamil Nadu Textbook and Education Service Corporation. Originally, it was published by Beacon Press, one of the popular international publishers. So we have co-published it, and Tamil Nadu Textbook Corporation going to bring out the trilingual version of his translation into 10 important languages. That is Albanian language, Scottish, and Swahili, and so many languages. His version will be the base for translating into other European and African languages. For that, we have signed an agreement with Mr. Thomas. So now I welcome Mr. Thomas for this great TNtalk. Thank you.
பாட்டு, கவிதை, செய்யுள் இதெல்லாம் பார்க்க முடியாதவை. நம்மை போல நம்ம பார்க்கிறோமேன்னு சொன்னீங்கன்னா பார்க்கிறோம். ஆனா நம்ம பார்க்கறது ஒரு தோற்றம். அதுக்கு பின்னாடி அது நமக்குள்ள எவ்வளவோ பார்க்க முடியாத விஷயம் இருக்கு. எத்தனையோ கதைகள், எத்தனையோ அனுபவங்கள். பாட்டும் அப்படிதான். பாட்டு ஒரு குண்டாகிய புத்தகத்துல மட்டும் மடிச்சு வச்சா பாட முடியாம போயிடும். நம் உள்ளத்தோடு பேச முடியாம போயிடும். பாட்டு விடுபட செய்யணும்னா பாட்டு சொல்லணும், கேட்கணும். உங்களை பத்தி, என்னை பத்தி, நம்மை பத்தி என்னதான் சொல்லுதுன்னு தெரிஞ்சிக்க வேண்டிய ஆர்வம் வேணும். அப்போதான் பாட்டு பாடும், பாட்டு பேசும். அதனால பாட்டு கேளுங்க, உறக்க சொல்லுங்க, மனசார பாடுங்கள. அன்போடு பாடினால் பாட்டின் வன்குண்டும் மறைந்து 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 போய்விடுமே. பணிவாகிய பெருமை பெற்ற பெரியவார்களே, முகந்தெரியா விருந்தோம்பி மகளும் தாய்மார்களும் தந்தைமார்களும் ஆகிய அன்பர்களே, நவதோறும் நூல்நாயம் போலும் நண்பர்களே, கசுதர கற்கும் குழந்தைகளை அனைவருக்கும் என் அன்பான வணக்கங்கள். A very warm greetings to everyone. Because in chapter 45 of the Tirukural, on what I've translated as gaining the help of the great, Periyare Tunai Kodal, Thiruvalluvar says this: Arivatulellam aridai, Periyare Peni Tamara Kodal. Rarest of rarities, cherishing the great as one's own. What I'd like to do today is to tell you the story of the help that I have gained from two great poets, from AVVAIYAR and from THIRUVALLUVAR. Poets who, among other things, have brought me the freedom to escape from the cage in which my understanding of poetry had been trapped. And because I am, among other things, a translator, and because part of my life's work has been to share the work of poets such as AVVAIYAR and THIRUVALLUVAR with the English-speaking world, I'll be speaking primarily in English. ஆனா அப்பப்போ சில கருத்து எனக்கு தமிழ்ல தான் வந்திருக்கு. அப்படி வந்த கருத்தெல்லாம் தமிழையே நான் பேச போறேன். I'll try to make the talk accessible to everyone. And of course, in the Q&A, we'll have a chance to discuss அப்போ வந்து தமிழா ஒரு கேள்வி கேட்கணும்னா தமிழையே கேட்கலாம். அதுக்கு பதில் தமிழ்ல தர்றேன். And of course, questions in English I'll answer in English. The year is 1989. I've unexpectedly received a fellowship to live for 2 years in the great city of Madurai in Tamil Nadu. I'm teaching at American College in Madurai, a great institution. I was teaching spoken English. I had the opportunity to study Tamil, and I had the opportunity to do research, lived, embodied research of any kind that I might wish to undertake. In my case, I wanted to live in a village. I wanted to experience directly what life in a village can be. The earlier speaker was talking about Gandhi, who's been very important to me also. And Gandhi had extraordinary things to say about what lives in India's villages. And inspired by that, I wanted myself to live in a village. So I took up the task of learning spoken Tamil. And I was blessed to have an extraordinary teacher appear in my life, the Tamil professor, Munivar Kuve Ramakodi, who was a professor at Saurashtra College. I would go to his house. I would study with him in his house in between my duties teaching at the college. I studied spoken Tamil with him for a year. After that year, I did move into a village outside the city of Madurai. There is a village called Valayapatti near the Madurai airport. And I took up a rented house in that village and began the process of learning to speak with people, interact with people, move with people in the village. Now, for people who are coming to Tamil from English, for instance, Tamil can be a very intimidating language. And for a long time I thought, if I can learn to speak Tamil or even understand half the things that people say to me, அது எனக்கு போதும், அதுக்கு மேலே எனக்கு வருமானு ரொம்ப ஒரு சந்தேகம் இருந்துச்சு. ஆனா வாத்தியார் ஒரு நாளைக்கு எனக்கு எதிர்பார்க்காத மாதிரி ஒன்று சொன்னாரு. நாளைக்குப்பா நம்ம எழுத்து தமிழ் படிக்க ஆரம்பிச்சிருவோம் அப்படின்னாரு. அது சரிங்க ஐயா, அது நல்லதுதான். ஆனா வந்து அந்த பேச்சு தமிழ் எனக்கு எவ்வளவு கஷ்டம் கொடுக்குது, இது அதுக்கு மேல எழுத்து தமிழ் படிக்கணுமா? நான் சொன்னேன், சரிப்பா அடுத்த வருஷம் நீ ஊருக்கு போறீங்களா? போன பிறகு நாங்க எழுதிய கடிதம் படிக்க வேண்டாமா? இல்லைங்க ஐயா, அது படிக்கணும். அதுக்கு தமிழ்ல பதில் எழுதி அனுப்ப வேண்டாமா? இல்லைங்க ஐயா, எழுதணும். So we began studying written Tamil. And we began by using the textbooks issued by the Tamil Nadu textbook for TNTB. We bought the whole stack. LKG, UKG, through 10th standard, 12 plus 2, like this. And we studied all of the essays and all of the short stories. But we didn't study any of the poems. And this actually was okay, because at this point in my life, I didn't understand poetry. We studied it in school, of course. But there, how did we study it? We analyzed poems, which is something like dissecting a frog. You kill the frog, you pin it to the table, you cut open that frog's belly, you peel back the skin, you dig around inside, and you bring out the organs. Indanga, kalliral. Indanga, nurayiral. Aha, look, here is the heart of the poem, the meaning. Shrunken, shriveled, lifeless. Not, in my experience, the best way to study poetry, or to get to know a frog for that matter. See, for me, my experience, poetry was something like a locked door. What I needed was a key, but nobody had given me a key, even though a key had been waiting for me all along. And this key had been waiting for me in my ear. I'll tell you what happened. After I studied the pile of books, textbooks, my teacher began me with the poetry of AVVAIYAR. He had me memorize some 25 poems from Mudurai. Because these poems were written in the 12th century by this esteemed poet, a woman, saint, really an extraordinary figure in Tamil literary history. Because they were written so long ago, even though my teacher gave me the meaning of each poem, I couldn't yet understand them directly. So all I could really do was recite them to myself. I would be on the bus, and I'd be reading those poems again and again. And certain lines lit up for me. Lines like, Neer mea எழுத்திற்கு நேர். As I listened to that line, there's something in this line. There's some rhythm to it. ஒரு இன்பம் இருக்கு, ஒரு இனிமை இருக்கு. கேக்குறீங்களா? நீர் மேல் எழுத்திற்கு நேர். It's a rhythm. Bum, bum, padadum, babum. நீர் இங்க இருக்கு. நேர் இங்க இருக்கு. The same consonants, different vowels. நீர் மேல் எழுத்திற்கு நேர். மேல், நேர். Same vowels, different consonants. In other words, the language itself had a music to it. And because I learned to appreciate and enjoy the music first, when I did come to understand the poem directly, I understood it all the more deeply. It sank all the more deeply into my heart because I had first heard the music of its meanings. The entire poem goes like this. படிச்சிருப்பீங்க. நல்லார் ஒருவருக்கு செய்து உபகாரம் கல்மேல் எழுத்து போல் காணுமே அல்லாது இருமலா நெஞ்சத்தார் ஈந்து உபகாரம் நீர் மேல் எழுத்திற்கு நேர். In my English translation, good done to a man of character, letters etched in stone. Good done to a man who lacks ethics and love, letters traced upon water. You do something good to somebody of character, they'll remember it forever, no matter how small that deed may have been. But if you do that same good deed to maybe it's a huge good deed to somebody who hasn't bothered to work on themselves, they're forgetting it even as you're doing it, like letters traced into water. So from AVVAIYAR, I learned not only what a poem can do, not only in Tamil, but in any language. I also learned about gratitude, the extraordinary importance of gratitude. And when I went back to the United States after that initial 2.5 years, I could suddenly hear English in a way I had never heard it before. I could read poetry, listen to poetry in English in a way I'd never heard it before. And that set me on my life's journey as a poet, as a writer, as a translator. I also translate from Spanish. And it brought me back several times, total of 5 years, back to Tamil Nadu. And this is where the second teacher enters the story. In 2003 and 2004, I received a Fulbright Fellowship. I came back to Tamil Nadu. I lived in this case with my Tamil teacher in his house, going back on the weekends to visit the village where I stayed because there I had been adopted into the village and had become a member of many families. And this year I studied, among other important works, the great Thirukkural of THIRUVALLUVAR. I studied all of the old commentaries. I memorized some 600, 700 of its verses. I even learned how to compose poems in the verse form that gives the Thirukkural its name, Kural or Kurulvenba. But I had no intention of translating this book. My only intention was to read it in Tamil, to think about it in Tamil. But for 12 years after that, my teacher would hint to me that somebody really ought to do a literary translation of this work. And I'd say, ஆமா ஐயா, அப்படிதான் பண்ணணும். கவிநயத்தோடு தான் மொழிபெயர்க்கணும். And then he would say, and if that person were to use those same commentaries that you and I studied, that would be something marvelous. To which I would say, of course, that would be the only way to do it, sir. Let somebody come along and do it. For 12 years, I didn't realize he was hinting in the most gentle way possible that I might take up such a task. But in 2016, I realized the hint. I had become, at this point, enough of a poet myself to dare to begin such an enormous task, and I began the translation that I then returned in 2017 to look at together with my teacher, my last time with my teacher in person. And then the translation came out in 2022 and has also been, as Dr. Shankar Saravanan mentioned, issued by TNTB in more recently. If AVVAIYAR taught me about gratitude, if one of the things AVVAIYAR taught me was about gratitude, one of the things that Thiruvalluvar has taught me about is openness to all people and all ways of life. For instance, there is a wonderful chapter in the Quran on hospitality. And we often think of hospitality as being the art of offering something to eat. Or if you don't have something to eat, you at least offer, say, a glass of water. But when Thiruvalluvar speaks of hospitality, he's not just speaking of the offering of food. He's speaking of how our hearts can join across the borders of language, across the borders of those people that we know and those people who are strangers to us. In his chapter on hospitality, he says, "Varavirundu vaaigalum ombuvan varkkai, paravandhu paradal indru," which I've translated as, the life that cherishes strangers each day never falls upon ruin. Now listen to Thiruvalluvar's certainty. He doesn't say the life that cherishes strangers each day probably won't fall upon ruin. Most likely you'll be okay, because of course the question arises. If I'm welcoming strangers into my home every single day, my resources will be depleted. What do I have left? But of course, such a question comes out of not yet understanding the way that Thiruvalluvar understood and understands. The ecology of relationships that goes into a practice such as Virundombu, hospitality. The ecology of practices, the ecology of relationships, both with human beings and with the earth beneath our feet and the rains and the sky overhead. So that Thiruvalluvar knew what he was saying when he said, the life that cherishes strangers each day never falls upon ruin. Varavirundu vaaigalum ombuvan varkkai, paravandhu paradal indru. Now, when I've spoken about the translation that I was suggested to do by my Tamil teacher, sometimes people have a question. ஆமாய்யா, நீங்க சரி திருக்குறள் 1000 பேர் மொழி பெயர்த்திருக்காங்க, அதுக்கு மேல இன்னொன்னு பண்ணிக்கிட்டா என்னையா லாபம்? The Quran has been translated into so many languages. Why? In English, many times. Why do another translation? And to that, I say this. From both AVVAIYAR and Thiruvalluvar, I've come to understand that how we say something is what we say. That we can't pick apart the way we say something and what we say. And both of these poets are extraordinary poets. The Quran is a book of poetry. But for more than 300 years, almost all translations, including the very first translation that was ever done, have translated just the Quran's ideas. Now, the ideas of the Quran are extraordinarily important. But to translate only the ideas is to miss the music of the language, its rhythm, its sonic vitality, the way that vowels and consonants dance with each other, to miss the playfulness and the sense of humor that Thiruvalluvar has even in speaking of the most difficult of life circumstances. Now, in the Q&A, we can talk about what does it mean to translate a verse of the Kuril as a Kuril. How do you translate, for instance, Yedugai Mone? How do you create a verse form in English like Kuril Venba? We can speak about these things. But let me give you just one way of tasting what I'm trying to talk about. There is a verse in the chapter on strength in speech, Solvanmai, which is particularly apt in describing Thiruvalluvar himself. Virainda thorol ketkum yalam, nirandinida solludal vallar perin. When one attains sweetness and order in words, the world rushes to listen. Thiruvalluvar has attained that sweetness and order, which is why we continue to cherish and read this work so many centuries later. And it is not just an idea. You can take any verse from Tirukkural and set it to any kind of music and it becomes singable. Virainda thorol ketkum yalam, nirandinida solludal vallar perin. Virainda thorol ketkum yalam, nirandinide solludal vallar perin. When one attains sweetness and order in words, the world rushes to listen. When one attains sweetness and order in words, the world rushes to listen. நன்றி கலந்த வணக்கம்.
Thank you, sir. Your humble talk was engaging, worth remembering, and magical. When you spoke about your experiences, we too traveled with you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Now, let us have a big round of applause for him. We never knew that you are a magician too, sir. Now it is question answer time. Audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and the mic will be given to you. And I invite both the speakers onto the stage for the question answer session. Audience, please raise your hands for the question. So we have a person in the audience in the blue shirt.
Yeah. My first question, I am Dr. Saravanan. My question to Mr. Thomas. So we are, as an educationist, always face the question how to introduce Tirukkural to children. Particularly, generally in our curriculum, we will be introducing the Anbudamai, Olukamudamai, like that. Whether it is appropriate or you are mentioning that it is more playful. So you are suggesting some other way to introduce Tirukkural to the children at earlier age.
Thank you, Dr. Saravanan. I think that's a wonderful question. Many people have asked me about this. As you heard in my talk, I have learned a lot from memorizing, whether it's AVVAIYAR or THIRUVALLUVAR. But I've always memorized out of a desire to carry a poem with me in my heart. I've watched a lot of young people in Tamil Nadu and in the Tamil diaspora who have also memorized Tirukkural. If they've memorized it out of the desire to carry it in their heart, it's a wonderful thing. But I've also seen children who've memorized it out of a kind of compulsion. பயத்தோடு இது பண்ணுவாங்க. ஐயோ நான் தப்பா சொல்லுவேனோ இப்போ அடிப்பாங்களோன்னு ஒரு பயம் இருக்கணும்லாம். And there is a danger in that of developing a kind of aversion toward Tirukkural. But my humble suggestion is that because these are poems, they have music in them, in their very composition. They have playfulness in them. And if we can share the playfulness of the language, if we can cultivate the desire to not only study but to enjoy the experience of these verses. அதாவது ரசிச்சு படிக்கணும், சுவைச்சு படிக்கணும். If we can teach that, then we will have given a foundation for people to then go on and study more verses and perhaps get verses by heart that will come to their aid at unexpected moments in their life. So I would say the more we can share the playfulness of Thiruvalluvar, the more we'll be able to play and live and work with this extraordinary piece of literature.
I was really spellbound on your talk. I don't know what to say. I forgot all the Tirukural now. Now, I want to ask you about the chapter on Marundu, right? Marundu, I would like to know, like Porul, you translated as the three kinds of, or three big categories of Tirukural, Aram, Porul, Inbam. Porul you translated as wealth, and that seems to be really the equivalent in English. So I really, I was amazed at your, the suitable word for that. And what did you say for Marundu? The chapter on Marundu, what was your title for Marundu?
It is such an interesting question how we translate particularly single words, because no single word ever in one language captures everything that it may capture in another language. So for Marundu, I did medicine. But I was thinking of how medicine can both be that substance that we may take as a matra or some kind of, that we take into the body, but also the art and practice of medicine. And I want to underscore one more thing here, which is that in translating Tirukkural, I have taken pains to try to translate the entire constellation of meanings, or the entire ecology of meanings that the Kural embodies. Because you come to a chapter like 95, medicine, Marundu, and you may think, oh, I know what Marundu is. I know what medicine is. But what Thiruvalluvar does is he turns our ideas upside down. He shakes them. He shows us how everything connects to everything. So, just for one example, there is the 10th verse of that chapter. Healer, patient, medicine, preparer. These four together are medicine. So we're not talking about medicine as a thing we imbibe. We're not talking about medicine just as the art and practice. We're talking about how do we cultivate that set of relationships, which is healing, which leads to our wholeness or helps us return to wholeness. So that's how I would answer your excellent question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Hello, Thomas sir. It was glad to meet you in this event. நீங்க வந்து ஃபர்ஸ்ட் டைம் மதுரையில் வந்து நீங்க வந்து தமிழ் கத்துக்கிட்டீங்க, அதுக்கப்புறம் தான் உங்களுக்கு தோணுச்சுன்னு சொன்னீங்க. தமிழ் கத்துக்கிட்டு அதுக்கப்புறம் திருக்குறள் படிச்சுட்டு அதை வந்து டிரான்ஸ்லேட் பண்றதுங்கிற ப்ராசஸ்ல எது வந்து நீங்க ரொம்ப சேலஞ்சிங்கான ஒரு பார்ட்டா நீங்க பாத்தீங்க?
அது வந்து ரொம்ப ரொம்ப கஷ்டமான ஒரு சேலஞ்சிங்கான பார்ட் ஒன்றும் சொல்ல முடியல. ஒரு பகுதி சொல்லலாம். அது என்ன பகுதி? அது குரல் இல்லை, அது ஆரம்பம். அதாவது வந்து இது செய்யலாமா, இந்த அளவுக்கு ஒரு செயல் என்னால் செய்ய முடியுமா என்கிற அந்த தயக்கத்தை நீக்கி போயிடணும்னு அதான் எனக்கு ரொம்ப கஷ்டமா இருந்துச்சு. அதுக்கப்புறம் நான் இறங்கிட்டேன், போயிட்டேன். Can I also ask a question? I wanted to ask a question of you, Aaron, actually. One of the things I found studying Tirukkural is that even though I have studied this work for more than 20 years, I continue to learn from it. I continue to be nourished by it. And listening to your talk about how this relationship between Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which I think is so important to highlight as you did, were you personally surprised by anything you learned about Gandhi, about MLK? Did you have any moments of aha or insight yourself?
Well, I would say that everything that I learned pretty much was surprising to me because I don't know what it's like here in the education system in India, but in the US, you don't learn about these global connections. You might learn about Dr. Martin Luther King, but you don't really understand his philosophies, and you don't understand that his philosophies are grounded in these global ideas that, we could argue goes back to thousands of years of humanity work and thinking and philosophy. And so I was really surprised that we don't learn this kind of material, this history in our schools, including when we have an entire holiday dedicated to Martin Luther King, just to talk about these global connections and this whole idea of not just civil rights, but how the civil rights movement was really a human rights movement. And King was thinking about this in terms of our living together as a global community, not just an individual community. So that was the first thing. And I would say the second thing that was really surprising to me was the fact that there were so many African Americans during the 1940s and even earlier on traveling to India to study these philosophies, these philosophies that go back thousands of years again, and then bringing them back to the United States to teach other African Americans. We don't realize that, we have this history and this shared past, a shared presence, and a shared future. And that's what I sort of left my research thinking about is if we have a shared past, what King understood was, and many of these civil rights leaders understood, was that we also have a shared future as a global community. And I think those are probably the two really surprising things to me. Yeah, thank you.
This question is for Aaron Bryant. I thank you for your wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask you to maybe give us some insights on the role of the photograph in mediating the relationship between philosophy, history, and art. And perhaps you could speak a little bit more broadly about your work, both as a scholar and a writer of books and as a curator, to think about the role of the visual in mediating this relationship and bearing witness.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I would actually say it's also the role of the artist in general, whether it's a poet or, any kind of writer or theater. But most certainly for me as the visual arts curator, the visual is everything. And so for me, I'm inspired by the visual in many ways that you would be inspired by the poetry that you read, the music and the poetry. For me, I'm inspired by the music and what I see in the photograph. So without the photograph, I'm almost, drained of any connection even to the history. So when you look at a photo, it's really important that you get what the photograph is emoting, and that's what the photographer is trying to convey. As a scholar, that's what I'm trying to convey. So it's all about the emotion that it captures and the experience that we can all connect to as human beings. It's really hard to sort of explain to someone, this is what you're supposed to feel when you look at this photo, without you looking at the photo and us engaging, even in an emotional conversation, an unspoken conversation about what we're feeling. And so I think that's essential. But more directly to your question, so I think that's true for all the arts. Particularly if there are artists out there, understand that you have a really important role in communicating to and for communities in many ways, and for yourself, first and foremost. But I would also say for me, as someone who does social documentary photography, photographs are absolutely important as evidence of trails and clues that these photographers are leaving behind, that I was here, he was here, she was here, they did this, they felt that these experiences were real, that they weren't just tales or things that we're thinking up. And I had the good fortune to actually speak with the photographer Bob Fitch to sort of confirm the things that his photograph was translating to me. So again, artists understand, if there are artists out there or anyone out there in any creative field, understand that part of what you do is you're leaving a trail of someone's existence, a cultural tradition, a community that we were here, and this is how we felt or saw a particular subject.
Good afternoon to everyone. I am Mrs. Charlata, Assistant Professor of English from Government Arts College, London. Both the speakers were excellent. My question is to Mr. Thomas. So while you were translating to Thirukural from one language to another, what kind of challenges you faced, especially the cultural barrier? That is one, when you translate a text from one culture to another culture, you would have faced several cultural barriers. Can you please just give one instance?
That's a wonderful question. There are certain words that are very particular to Tamil and to the Guru. Some of which could be rendered in English, some of which could be rendered in English with the help of the commentary that I also included with my translation. But there were a couple words that were much more difficult. I'll give you just one example, which is the word tavam. Historically, translators have translated tavam as penance. However, tavam isn't exactly penance. What is penance? Penance is you did something wrong, you committed some sin, and you undertake a form of penance to ameliorate the wrongdoing. But tavam isn't like that. You don't have to have done something wrong to undertake tavam. You undertake tavam because you have some inner necessity to undertake tavam. So I thought, okay, why not just put the word tavam into the English language? Because that chapter on tavam is Thiruvalluvar telling us what is tavam, right? So if the chapter title is tavam, then let Thiruvalluvar be our teacher and tell us all of the meanings of tavam. And as he does everywhere in the Quran, we find ourselves engaging again in what I've been calling this ecology of meaning, whereby ideas are woven together, just as Dr. Aaron Bryant was talking about this making connections, bringing things together. This is part of the genius of Thiruvalluvar. And I wanted to add one more point about this dialogue between Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because Thiruvalluvar is also in this dialogue. Because the Count Leo Tolstoy sent a translation of Tirukural to Gandhi, and Gandhi became quite enamored with Tirukural. So much so that he wanted to learn Tamil so he could read Tirukural in Tamil. He had that much affection. In fact, we can make a study of how the principles of nonviolence have been nourished by the principles of Thiruvalluvar. So in fact, Thiruvalluvar has also been speaking to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Through Gandhi. And we have been all speaking here together and engaging in a connective dialogue, which can allow us to entertain the possibility of a future that can be hopeful and whole. So I'm grateful for your question. I'm grateful to share the stage with you. Thank you all very much.
Now, I request all the participants who had questioned our speakers to come on the stage to have a photograph with our speakers. May I call upon Mr. Eric Atkins to join us on the stage? Thank you. Now, we'd request our speakers to remain on the stage. Now, the vote of thanks will be delivered by Dr. S. Kamakshi, Chief Librarian and Information Officer of ACL, and it will be followed by the group photograph session with the colleges, the group photograph session of the speaker with the colleges.
Thank you, Reena. Okay, no problem. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, and dear friends. I am honored to deliver this vote of thanks on behalf of the Director of Public Library and our Centenary Library also. First and foremost, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished speakers, Dr. Aaron Bryant and Mr. Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, for sharing their invaluable insights and expertise with us today. Dr. Bryant's thought-provoking discussions on the relevance of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. was truly enlightening, while Pruiksma's inspiring journey with the AVVAIYAR and THIRUVALLUVAR was a testament to the power of perseverance and determination. And also, I would also like to express our sincere appreciation to Mr. Eric Atkins, Public Diplomacy Officers, U.S. Consul General Chennai, for introducing Dr. Bryant, and Dr. Sankara Saravanan, JDF, Tamil Nadu Textbook Corporation, for introducing Mr. Pruiksma. And also our gratitude also goes to our Director, P. Shankara ES, Director of Public Libraries, and our Joint Director for their support and guidance to the programs. And also I extend my heartfelt thanks to AC Innovation and ACL team and Kalvi Tolikachi and users of ACLs. Thank you for your tireless efforts in making this program as a success. I thank all the college principals and professors and librarians and students, those who are coming to and part of this program. Thank you so much. Last but not least, I would like to thank all the students who attended today's event and also users of the ACL. So thank you be here part of this remarkable journey. May the insights and the inspiration gained from today's event continue to guide us in our personal and professional lives. And thanks Mr. Biju from our American Consulate to continue support to grand success of the event. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.